What did Aristotle say to Plato after losing to him in a wrestling match?
I'm leaving. I don't know what.
My ideas will be back.
Okay.
We got the laugh. We got the laugh. We got the chuckle.
The pity laugh. You got the pity laugh. Yeah.
Well, I have another one if you need another.
I need, bro. I desperately need. Go on.
What did Plato say to Aristotle? Would you love me if I was a form?
Oh, okay. That one's way better. That should have been the opener. You know what my opening line for this was today? If it wasn't you,
What?
who wants to live in London? That's it. It's not even a joke. But who wants to live in a place that's so clearly on the come down, not the come up? It just doesn't make sense, man.
Half of New Zealand, apparently.
Yeah, totally. But we're not here to talk about immigration and walls and penetration. We're here to talk about Aristotle and metaphysics on Lucatella's channel. With your
can I first? No, you go, and then I'm going to explain my first joke so that people get it. And hey, it doesn't mean that the joke's any better, but at least people understand the joke. Sorry, continue your intro.
As Leonard Hofstadter said to Sheldon Cooper, yeah, Sheldon, it only gets funnier when you explain it. So, you go on, man. Tell us why that's funny and why we were supposed to laugh.
Perfect. Well, after losing to Plato, whose name is Broad Shoulders, in a wrestling match, Aristotle had mad something envy about it and, only wanted to take down his master by saying his ideas will be back, and ideas being the thing that could once and for all take down and pin Plato. So yeah, this whole kind of psychodynamic father figure joke.
Do you want to say anything else on that?
Nope.
Welcome to Lucatella's YouTube channel. You're joined by your bespectacled host, newly bespectacled. My vision's on the come down. So the doctor, because I ran to the doctor, the first thing happens to me and I run to the doctor for medication and diagnosis. So I don't have 20/20 vision anymore. I'm myopic, not only in spirit, but in literal sight. And so, yeah, welcome, Alex. How are you feeling? It's great to be back. We're going to do a bunch today, but yeah, how are you feeling first and foremost? And when was your last run and swim?
Entering a chat like this and laughter is always a great way and always a sure telling sign of the lightheartedness of spirit that one is bringing. I was running on Saturday, playing football. Our team's on a strong run at the moment. So yeah, we've played our first 13 games and won 12 and drawn 1. So really doing well in the Auckland Premier Division. That's always a great boost and a great high to be around the teammates there. It definitely lifts the spirits in a similar way that getting through 13 episodes does. So 13 game, we're doing, an episode and a game are just fully in conjunction now. If someone still wants to say that it's a coincidence, then be my guest.
Yeah, and there'd have to be a Virgo to say that, right? And we don't want Virgos. We only want Capricorns around these here parts. But yeah, 13 games, 13 episodes. Yeah, I mean, we're past the halfway point now. It's looked like we would never get to this stage when we first began because I feel like we just, marauded through a chunk of text and material, and then we opened the book and we were like less than 10% of the way through. But then the next little phase, the middle period, got a lot more breezy and allowed for a lot more input from us as well, which was a welcome change and one that we licensed ourselves for and that the viewers demanded. So they said, we want to, as you can see in the comments of previous videos, we're not here for Aristotle. We're here for you two's input on Aristotle and what can you bring to the table in Deleuzian spirit. It's not what Kant said, it's what Kant can be made to do. So we're trying to do that here with Aristotle and clearly being very successful with it and looks maxing along the way.
Yeah, we're seeing what Hegel can do on the table of Aristotle. So where Aristotle's concepts get us to in a pseudo-Hegelian fashion, which is also to incorporate thinkers like Deleuze, Lacan, all your Frenchies, and then a few of the Germans along the way as well.
Well, yeah, all my Frenchies, like the Germans. This is why me and you are perfectly poised for this, is because I thought when we began this that this was going to be like a Nietzschean and a Hegelian's take on Aristotle, and it has been, but the amount of Hegel that's in Nietzsche and the amount of Nietzsche that's predated or somehow prefigured in Hegel is just remarkable. And I didn't know that starting this. So there's this amazing cross-wiring and symbiotic nature to our respective inputs.
Yeah, honestly. Yeah, totally.
So please subscribe. Okay. So yeah, in this episode, we'll be speaking more proper to a new book and the next chapter / book in Aristotle's Metaphysics. It's called Eta or Eta, the next letter in the Greek alphabet as well. It comes, I'm forgetting the last one. Was it Zeta, the last one?
Yeah.
Yeah, and precedes Theta. So we're halfway between those two. And yeah, we're going to try and fixate on this chapter as truly and as properly as we can today. I'm sure just naturally there'll be overlap and underlap from preceding and succeeding books and chapters, and from the panoply of the Western canon that we are so well enmeshed and entrenched in, me and Alex, because all we do is study. So yeah, we're going to pull from various academics, rappers, swimmers, athletes, musicians, whatever, because rappers aren't musicians, so that's a separate category. But anyway, when I was perusing through Eta and then second time over getting into it less cursorily and more in depth, I realized and I felt a real reemergence of the spirit of the AI angle that we talked a bit about in the first half of this series, mainly because of consciousness, sentience. What does it take to make an entity come to life? What's the kind of like cement that keeps the bricks, in tandem and glued together with one another, that cements, what is the cement that cements something? The central question that it all sort of boiled down to me repeatedly was what makes something more than the sum of its parts, to put it very straightforwardly. Previous discussions surrounding technological advents and invasion into our lives, to the point of feeling like the walls were closing in on us as a Dasein, pertain more to topics like human identity, what is unable to be captured about us, what makes us special. But I guess this time around I was feeling more of a spirit, that too, but more of a spirit of, what is it exactly at that point of emergence of life? Like, what is it that brings something together? If the previous question was, we injuncted about this last time, saying the ass arrives most beautiful and brave, can we refigure that into, when does the eidos arrive most beautiful and brave, unabashedly, unashamedly? So those were kind of my swirling thoughts in the vortex of book Eta as an introduction. Any thoughts on that, sir?
Yeah, it's sort of how, some of the theme that we've been talking about is Aristotle as being a kind of substance atomist, in the sense of going very much to the bare bones to construct a substance and build it up. But here, when we want to lean into different figures and different ideas and see, like, okay, if Aristotle went to the bedrock and built up just a little bit and then went to talk, and then had different separate subjects and fields, like, how can we build it up even more? Or what categories can we use to really connect it to be a philosophy of a life, a natural science, rather than a physical or substantive science, which is almost too separated and distinct from the rest of our discourse in life. Like, how often are we really considering substance and essence and substrate when making decisions? It's almost like we're not. So how can we factor in a metaphysical views that also contains a value-laden approach to understanding cosmos? How can we do metaphysics that incorporates values? And I think it's part of the movement of 21st century philosophy. Like, very recently, I think as well, like, they're prefigured, as we see in Nietzsche, where values and art becomes such a important cursor to metaphysics itself, right? Like, how can we purify instincts in such a way that we're really going, into the heights of spirituality? The depths of my sexuality reach into the heights of my spirituality is something kind of attributed to Nietzsche. And so there's a real a height and a flight that we must get to with our own spirit that comes round to find values within metaphysical and ontic classification itself. Like, it's to say that values are ontic. And I think what we're doing is we're actually seeing that we want to make Aristotle's metaphysics a bit more ontic in the way where it needs to take up value and be incorporated into that value sphere, which is where we are and where we operate. We're not, when we make any decision in life, it's values based, it's emotions based. And so we need metaphysics to be and act in that arena for us as well. And that's why, like, when you talk about Heidegger and how figures like that are coming in, the Dasein, that's where we are almost doing a metaphysics of the human experience, phenomenology.
Yes, very well said. And there's a tendency to gravitate towards the negative for a lot of human beings. The unhealthier the consciousness, the more true that is. And what we don't want to do when we're engaging in true metaphysics now, because I think this section of the book is very much in the weeds of metaphysics, substance, substrate, and these types of topics. What you don't want to do is wriggle away from the emotive and not have a space for pathos in general. It is one of the holy triumvirate for a reason. So we need to allow for a space for it, and maybe even superimpose its involvement in the triumvirate and ensure it stays there, because we discussed in the first 2 episodes it's a bit lacking in Aristotle, partly just because of circumstance. It's it's lecture notes, like we always say, but the most we get from him in terms of genuine psychic animation seems to be just making jokes here and there, but that too at the cost of someone else. So can we kind of reinvigorate and reanimate kind of like a frolicking, rollicking dance to life, and do so in the face of the pressures and obstacles that we face, is the question. We always start the introduction with a quote, so I have a song lyric I want to say, but before that, I think everything we're speaking about here is really apt, and if it was to be boiled down to a one-word answer, I think we know what Aristotle's answer to a lot of the jokes as a punchline would be, but also his serious answer would be always form is the answer, in terms of what persists through change, what is most substantial. Like, if it had to be a one word, I think it would still be that more than any other word, as that which pervades and ensconces all of reality and surrounding potentiality. I did find a lot of these sections were rugged and dry, particularly, and that's kind of why I'm saying we're in the weeds of it now. We're really in the thick of it. But if the answer is form, the question is something like, what kind of unity must exist for us to say that there is a being here at all? And just to open with the quote, everyone will know the song Live Your Life, Rihanna. And there's a rapper in there who has his feature, and he's saying, seems as though you lost sight of what's important when depositing them checks into your bank account and you up out of poverty. Your values is a disarray, prioritizing horribly, unhappy with the riches because you're piss poor morally, ignoring all prior advice and forewarning, and we mighty full of ourselves all of a sudden, aren't we? So yeah, even he realizes that you're unhappy with the riches because you're piss poor morally. So how do we do that without becoming moral beings full of ressentiment and unhappy consciousnesses, and with, the camel-laden beast who's just weighed down by his conscience? How do we do that in a 21st and, dare I say, even a 22nd century way? Why do we need to wait 80 years for the 22nd century? Just do it now. So that was the quote. I always like saying some sort of words from someone else and bring them in and kind of set the scene and the tone and the undertone, more importantly, to the tone we will ourselves consciously set in the forthcoming discussion. But we always also begin with the recap. So would you like to launch into that, my good sir?
I'd love to, and just with one appendage, and it just made me curious in what you'd said before, and kind of as a way to summarize the Gestalt, or the general leaning that Aristotle has in a word. Your word was form. I kind of made a joke of how that's not the word for Aristotle. Like, that's the word for Plato to my reading, and it almost seems like, and as we'll explore in this chapter, that it's kind of an equal between form and matter. And he kind of negates something like mathematics because of its lack of matter, and would say that it's therefore more like an abstraction of something that does have matter. So, yeah, I'm almost wondering on what grounds, again, like the metaphor, on what grounds, on what matter do you say that it's form?
Yeah, because I was trying to stray away from words like hylomorphism as an answer. If the answer is A, B, I want to, just for the sake of simplicity and clarity, say A or B. And if I had to, and was pressed, I would say that he would say form. Yeah, it was more in that spirit.
Yeah, yeah, fair. I would,
And
yeah, I
also,
would.
I don't know if you get the sense as well, but I feel like he rejects Plato to come back to Plato in a unplatonic way. So it's not that he's just like, yeah, brandishing this weapon out to kill anyone who's not completely abiding by his metaphysics. But yeah, like it is. No, it's like, is the answer form, Aristotle? No, it's form. You know, and that's the kind of sense I
Yeah,
got
yeah,
from
right,
him.
right. He kills Plato to come back to him. I think, but in that sense, like that is why Hegel was such an admirer, because he's like bringing like almost contradiction and like innate movement to a concept like substance. He's kind of showing how substance contains a sort of self-negation, like in the way that he negates form only to come back to form in a way. But I would tend to see that it's more honest to Aristotle to see him in that holomorphic state, and that we couldn't put him in either category, because he's just like, that he's a magnetic field, and you can't have a magnetic field by specifying one pole.
Yes. Yeah. And we kind of paid homage to that when we were saying how much of Aristotle there somehow accidentally is in Deleuze, right? Fields of relations, virtual networks, these kinds of ideas where there's an, like, what is the essence of a man? Distributed cognition. And like, but because he didn't have the terminology, the lexicon, the worldview, and the purview to say that, he said the utmost he could back then in that space, kind of, if that makes sense. So no, you can't. I was talking to one of the people, friends of the show, yesterday about this exact topic of what is the soul of a man? What is the essence? You can't point to it. If you can point to it, it's clearly not the soul. Like, there is no soul for Nietzsche, and for me as well. I would say that's a misnomer or a miscategorization. But if you
It's
can point,
almost for Nietzsche that like we go too high when we look to what a soul is. Like we need to go lower to discover a soul.
the
We need
reason
to
you
like
can't
just
find God is because you're not looking low enough.
right, right,
Right.
right.
And yeah, so absolutely, man. I think it's the truth as veritas idea, without getting into the discussion too heavy-handedly already. But when you start to think that the nature of discovery or creation is one of zeroing in, you're doing this antithesis of discovery and knowledge, like, accidentally. Surely it's not zeroing in, but zeroing out. The motion should be this way, not that way, because if you're pointing and if you're getting closer and closer, um, like asymptotically towards an essence, you're probably getting further and further from the actual essence that matters. So yeah, that was just a bit random thought.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'll take us into the recap now then. And as I've kind of said from last time, one way I like to do this now is to give a one sentence synthesis of 2 episodes ago, and then get into the recap of 1 episode ago. And it just helps me to, really condense what happened in an episode into one sentence. And I think that is like it's like an ultimate compression of where is so much into what is so few, like a real simple, like it's the exercise of simplification in that is like just marvelous. It's, makes something like, yeah, you're able to communicate in such a way where each and every word in that sentence relates to like 10 minutes of deep speech. And so each and every word is just now condensed and packed and full of poetic.
I can write in one sentence what it takes a book others to say is what you're.
Come on, man. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's Nietzschean. And as we see, this is just Nietzsche and Hegel's read on Aristotle. So episode 12 was just an all-time favorite for me, not necessarily because we covered a lot of ground on Aristotle, but because there was so much energy and life that was just interwoven and a part of it. And that spanned from mythology and spiritual transformation, and discussion from philosophers like Nietzsche and Heidegger in this moment. So we took a pause to gather some respite from the Frenchies, and we turned to some of the, some from the German tradition. In episode 13, then, we finished Zeta and got confusingly deep into Aristotle's notion of substance. There was that, almost in the way of reading Hegel, gives you that sort of dizzying feeling. It was sort of like that when we got to the bedrock of Aristotle. How is the substrate something that is only really disclosed when we kind of reflect upon it, or when we consider the relation between substance and essence? Do we only then find, like, when we apply some conscious inquiry into it, does it stand out and reveal itself? It's only when we see substance and essence in the foreground do we then get a glimmer of substrate in the background. That's why it had that confusion quality. It's also the, as you said, 0 of philosophy, in a sense, going back, to the beginning, also going back to the most foundational topic, and going to the most foundational part of that for Aristotle. So it really is like a tripling down of the zero, the crux and foundation of so much that has got started in philosophy and carries through today. So some real weight and potency that we're maneuvering with, and doing our best to stay afloat, which I think we are doing very well. And as we're kind of talking in the lead up to this, how we feel like the quality of these episodes is really improving, and we are able to really add some kind of original syntheses, and also think through different thinkers, and also stay true to what Aristotle is saying, and also extrapolate it into relevance for today. And it's this whole journey of discovery that's happening, and I think it is, it's just awesome to be a part of. And so Aristotle starts off by sort of noticing that, okay, if we take a typical example of whiteness, and we want to look at sort of the essence and substance of what that is, he would observe that we only get to see whiteness when it's on a surface. There's something interdependable about the surface that it's on, and to see the form of what is itself. And he also notices that when we remove, like, we don't though need the panel or the surface for the form of whiteness. There's an almost contradiction between something showing up in matter, but also its form not like exactly being housed in matter. So there's almost that bifurcation of form and matter that he's seeing, and that he attempts to build a philosophy around. It's also where we get this idea of the non-essential, and we know that it's a big thing for Aristotle and how he comes to determine substance. And it's actually what he begins to do at the start of the book, Zeta. He really goes on this journey of subtraction to try and find what is essential. And it's kind of funny, he like subtracts and subtracts, and in the end goes all the way to like, okay, he goes to this thought experiment of, if we subtracted all of the qualities and attributes of something, we would get to something like prime matter, all properties removed. It's a kind of ultimate subtraction that gets him to pure potentia, pure potential. But he's not, he thinks it can't be the ground of what substance is, because it loses its thisness. If it's pure potentia, if it's like pure being, as we spoke about, then it doesn't have its difference or definability. And he thinks that substance needs difference and definability in a more strict sense. And so
I'll just say quickly, that's where substrate comes in. To answer what persists through change, we have to realize the reason we can recognize something persisting through the endless change is because there's something that doesn't, namely the substrate.
Yeah. And so Aristotle does seem to say, if something's removable, it's excluded from the meaningful makeup of what something is. And I think there's like also a part there that we are kind of in contention with, that we're wrestling with. We're not totally sold on that. We almost want to say that's a key part in which he sort of goes the other way and goes more into that purist mathematical ideal sense and not into like the real and the kind of practically groundable. Because we want to say more to the lines of something doesn't necessarily need to be essential to be substantial about a thing, that actually the interaction with non-essential qualities like movement, like process, are necessarily what constitutes the real and the substantial. But it's interesting, Aristotle, in some other areas, as we discussed when we were talking about the difference between process, metaphysic, and substance, he does almost leave the door open to that process metaphysic. And yeah, so it's interesting where to place Aristotle. He's in some ways hard to very much place, and so there's also the danger of thinking about him in this representational way, where Aristotle thought this was what he said, this is what he meant. Like he really is sort of elusively around in every kind of area and also around in no area, just like his concepts, just like the emptiness of his concepts of substance, essence, and substrate. That they don't actually hold that representational weight that we would like him to be, to make him more easy and less dizzying to read. So yeah, we're pushing him to a place of greater relevance for us as young adults in the 21st century. We want to include value in our metaphysics, and we want to evolve our conception of metaphysics and of value to be able to work together, because it's for a similar reason that Spinoza wrote his treatise on essentially metaphysics and ontology as the ethics. He called it the ethics, and then you open it and it's just like this calculus of geometry and space-time and the world. But he kind of wants to really show that at the most fundamental level, it's not about, truth, and it's not about like the real, it's about value and ethics. That is the world of the human. Yeah, even just a comment on the form of Aristotle's writing. We talked about the emptiness of his words and how it's really the only, almost like the core of his metaphysics is this relational self-determination between concepts, where each of them in itself like is substantial, sure, but really to understand it in its depth needs to be seen in relation to the other components of it. I've got a metaphor for applying this to contemporary physics to help make sense of it more, so we'll come to that later. But I think is he not like through this process of detraction and detraction, training us to go deeper and deeper into the metaphysical heart of life, of existence, of intelligibility? Is he not really, like Hegel is doing, training the reader as we go through this reading to have internal transformation take place, just so that we can grasp what he's saying? So where we get to is not a representationalist mode, but it should be a relationalist mode, where we're then in relation to the ideas and we're trained to be thinking in relational terms rather than representational terms. Because when we try and be representational and apply that to Aristotle, we get dismantled, we get dizzied, we get thrown around, we get contradictions, we get all of that. But if we look at it relationally, then we can actually see that there is implicit relation and self-negation within the relational mode. And that's just something that we need to kind of learn and grow with. Is substance astral? Is it something that's invoked only through the conscious inquiry? And when we look at it in this relational way, like what is the astral but the deeper relational fields that we're in touch with? So there's a way in which almost a kind of like there's the door's open for process metaphysics, the door's open for mysticism, the door's open for materialism. Like it's contained. I think like
tell me what you want, I've got it in bucket loads. Yeah.
If I had a word for Aristotle, it's just like containment, like the ultimate way of doing that. Yeah, there's an elusive layer to Aristotle, and I think that it's almost through that elusive guise that we get to something like substrate as housing substance. As you said, the matter or the condition, the possibility that exists among all change that can continue to show up and continue to presence substance. This is crazy. Like just where we are, what I've said is like, I had 2 cups of coffee today. I'd never do that. And I'm not saying that that's what this is, but I just want to say that I'm not sober.
Inebriated by the campfire.
Oh, intoxicologists by the illumination. We then get into, as we further developed and explored Zeta, how there was the role that definition had in substance. So definition's been a substantive and exhaustive account of essence. And we looked at the ways that, for Aristotle to sort of contain the truth and the real determination of what something is could be done through a definition, but only to certain classes of things, because sometimes a definition just cannot give the full comprehension of what something is. But for something like species, which is the true characteristics of what a class is, like a class of objects, it's almost meets the necessary and sufficient criteria for determining what it is, and therefore with that full determination of what something is, i.e. by giving it the definition of its species, you then found that the definition had a kind of substance to it, that it was that the description was ontic. It really housed the metaphysical import of something. And I think that there's kind of a couple of points that stem from that, and some of which we discussed, but others which are just kind of contained in this recap as part of the synthesis of processing this, in the same way that your body processes food and water, and it takes 2 to 3 days for that to fully complete its cycle, and you extract nutrients and that gets turned into energy in the body. The same way that these ideas pass through, and when I'm sleeping, they're integrated emotionally, and when I'm thinking during the day, they're integrated psychically. All of that still needs to happen for me to be fully done with the idea. And for me, that part of the discussion raised the question of, can we get to ontological truth via propositional knowledge? Like, do we get access to the ontic via the propositional, to put it in almost that more Vivekian language of different kinds of knowing, the least of which being propositions, because then you get like the actions and the doing of things, the procedural, as a way to know something, the perspectival and the participatory. So it's very kind of low stakes to be at the propositional in some sense, and propositional is like nested within these deeper fields. And so in a similar way that Aristotle says something that is just a form is an abstraction from something that is substantial, like numbers are an abstraction from something that is substantial, so too propositional knowledge is an abstraction from something that is actual. And I think it raises interesting questions, because, okay, does even this low common denominator of knowing give us access to substance, to the real? And I really like what you said about, hey, when we think about this, is like, are we sure that Aristotle was thinking about this in terms of propositional knowledge? Like, is what Aristotle meaning by the definition of something just what is reducible to language? Or is it actually like not just linguistic comprehension, but like the verbal matrix of comprehension? So more like how we would think about and conceive of something, and our mental grasping of an object as its definition, how that actually opens up to a different reading of Aristotle to say what he means by definition is not just the Webster dictionary, what's on the page there, but it's actually the form, like what our nous, what our spirit, what our intellect can create as a container for that is its definition. And in that sense, then you can see why there is something perhaps more closer to the definition of something being ontic, as we read in Aristotle. Another, like the second line of reasoning, the second way of me digesting and processing the thoughts about that were how, and this relates to that theme of technology, how far does true propositional knowledge get you when we're interacting with large language models and ChatGPT today? We can have really, insightful discussions and like discourse with it, which is just this machine which is hyper good at, being trained on like large language models. It's not, large procedural models. It's not large participatory models. It's large language models. And so it has a kind of ontological limit as to what it can like represent, as what it can relate to. I think there actually isn't a limit to what it can represent, but there's a limit to what it can relate to. And as we said, in the same way that applies to Aristotle, he is not someone that is representational in his philosophy. He's relational. And we saw the big difference that has in reading Aristotle. And so if we apply that to technology and AI, we're going to be fooled and misguided if we think that its intelligence is, far greater or more outstanding. Maybe its intelligence could be, but is its rationality, is its wisdom? And the answer as it stands today is definitely not. And could it ever be is a question that we are, I think, kind of gonna be asking and answering in the next 200 years. There was a lot there, so I'll just pick up on a few extra points to finish this, and then we can kind of continue the discussion. Yeah, what we kind of got to at the end was the connection between form and matter is interdependable in something that is produced naturally, but if it's not produced naturally, then it means that the form and matter intersection is not necessarily tied together. The example of this is when you create a bed out of wood. Yep, you have the form of a bed, which is, the definition of a bed, but then you have the matter of it, which is wood in this case. However, a bed is not necessarily needing to be made out of wood. It could be made out of cardboard, it could be made out of plastic, it could be made out of a stone. These things can still be a bed because they're artificially made, and therefore you kind of lose that connection to the matter of something. However, for naturally produced and created things, the matter and the form of it are interconnected, and you cannot change the matter of something. I think
that on its own is rather interesting, because like if someone was completely new to this, they would say, can you have a cardboard bed? I know you didn't mean that really substantially, but isn't functionality the core principle there of like, if I have a bed is that which I can sleep on, can I sleep on a cardboard bed? No. But is it still a bed in the sense that it has the form of a bed and it looks like a bed and I can lie down on it, just not for 8 hours,
Small point on there. I had a friend who ordered a cardboard bed base, and it was one that was like sustainably produced and would fold out and sit in this upright way. So I did substantially mean it as that.
Damn.
But to your point of what you're saying, yeah, it's almost like how the matter of something changes the concept of it, and so therefore like changes the form of it. So yeah, there's like
because if matter is a influence on form and form is about functionality, you would think that matter is very influential on form, right? But also, was this sustainable bed ordering friend a vegan?
No.
So the whole story is a sham.
I think they were compensating for not being a vegan.
Yeah, I've aired my lord. I have to make up for it somehow somewhere else.
Yeah, the final point that I'll say here on the recap was our discussion on the different ways of how form and matter interact. It interacts in a way that is psychically seductive. We talked about Tool's mathematical music and how there's a Fibonacci sequence to the layout and structure and musical composition of the song, and that does like ring true to a part of ourselves, to a part of our own internal chemistry and makeup. And we also looked at the story of Apollo Creed, which, you know, talked about that exchange between the matter and the potential of who we are, and the form, the actuality, the identity of who we are. How that there's a strong tension and dialectic that runs through the movie between Rocky and Apollo, where you see those ideas foregrounded in one person and backgrounded in the other, and they have this fight and they switch, and then it's foregrounded in one and backgrounded in the other, and how even through that process of self-triumph and growth to be who you want to be in your actualization, it was this interplay between the duality of the other, and that was a kind of process of form and matter being there. So also just to plug that on the YouTube channel, we have a new video of that exact story. So if there's interest in that, I definitely recommend you check out this 20-minute video essay, which goes deep into theory and analysis, but it will leave you with a new perspective on one of these classic movies.
Thank you so much. Is that the end of the recap?
That's the end.
Well, that was rather enjoyable and a bit of a voyage as well. I loved it, man. I loved it. You weave in a lot of elements pretty seamlessly. So well done to you for that. And as does Aristotle, you know, like I think that was the takeaway for me, was his concepts are not to be found here nor there, but everywhere. And also him as a person making, you know, as the cognizing subject, we've dubbed it, he's also equally evasive and elusive of our grasp. So just when you try to pin him down and say, well, his answer would be form, it wouldn't. But like, yeah, but it also would. In some cases it would. And it just depends on how many carbs are in his system, you know, like what day did you catch this motherfucker on? Like that's all that matters, really. Yeah, I mean, are you happy to get into Ida more properly now? Because I
Yeah,
had
it wouldn't be form, but it wouldn't not be form. Yeah, I'm yeah, good to progress and unpick this a little more.
And the meta concept there is that he is so ardent on the law of non-contradiction, but then also doesn't live by it. So he's probably not, you know. That's in itself rather amusing. But yeah, the first thought I had regarding substance and substrate and kind of the initial stages of Ida was just what we touched upon initially, which is that substrate, boiled down to a simple definition, is just the thing that stays constant throughout the change of the substance and allows us to perceive and intelligibilize the substance. And there's many views and definitions on what substrate is in reference and in deference to substance. And in the initial stages of Ida, I guess Aristotle speaks of how he refutes and has a strong rebuttal for, I don't know how to say his name. Is it Democritus? Democritus? How do you say it?
I think Democritus.
Democritus. Okay. So he speaks of Democritus's postulation of what constitutes substrate. It's either an Ida 1 or 2, but for Democritus, a substrate is two things: uniform, so there's a unity and there's a uniformity where we can understand it. And in his case, I guess as an atomist, it's material, generally speaking. He's not saying that that's the exhaustive definition, but for the cases and point of understanding, you can say that a substrate can be material. And yeah, and material means consists or is comprised of atomic particles. So there are atoms and subatomic particles in it. How one substrate is differentiated from another one is based on, for Democritus, shape, position, and disposition is what it said in one of the chapters. Also synonymous with the words rhythm, slant, and deployment is how you tell it one substrate out from another. Famously, Democritus, I don't know how to say his name, but he was influential on Galileo when he was doing his experiments and discoveries and bringing to the table what contribution he had, you know, more than a millennia later. But then obviously Aristotle, sometimes we dub him as a reductionist, which he's not. He's not an anti-reductionist either. You know, like he sees a lot of worth in condensation and distillation as a principle. But in his anti-reductionist, with his anti-reductionist hat on, I guess Aristotle opposes Democritus here and says it's way more complex than that. It doesn't mean that what he's saying is wrong. There is a material component to substrate. But it's just not so arid. It's not so easily point-toable. So those were some opening thoughts on Aristotle's refutal of Democritus. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Question. Democritus, like, was Aristotle trying to sublate Democritus by saying that he was only speaking up to substrate?
Yes. So he wasn't conclusive, or he wasn't getting enough of reality in his definition. Not that he was wrong.
Yeah. So it's sort of like how at the very start of the Metaphysics, we again get this pattern of Aristotle, almost being a bit more enlivened by these ideas that other philosophers before him had, and he sublates them in a system. He says, okay, Heraclitus, like, you have this, strict principle of change, and that's all very well and good, but here you're only explaining the efficient cause. You're only explaining like how and why things move. You're only giving us the explanation of change in your scheme. You don't have that notion of like what it's changing for and to, or what is the physical components that are causing this change. So he wanted to take a thinker like Heraclitus, who far exceeds the categorization that Aristotle gave to him, and sublate him into a system. I think there's strength to that in saying, hey, I'm accounting for you and I'm taking you to a higher synthesis, but you also, by doing that and fitting him to your system, lose some of the essence of what the thinker was. And it almost seems like here, Aristotle is, partly taking influence by Democritus, but just placing him in to say like, hey, these characteristics that you're describing about, base reality are true in some ways, but not complete. And so here you sit in my concept of substrate, but there's also essence, there's also substance, and that is where I can take your philosophy further, essentially. So I wonder if that's the dynamic that was happening here too.
Absolutely. And more historically, it's worth noting that Aristotle had access to Democritus in a way that we just don't, because his writings didn't survive and we only have secondhand and fragments of his works, whereas Aristotle in his time would have had the privilege and the pleasure and the displeasure of reading Democritus firsthand. I don't know where the timings align and whether they would have even known someone who knew the other person and kind of had a 1 or 2 degrees of separation type relationship as well. But yeah, absolutely, man. I can definitely feel into the spirit of what you're saying, where I kept feeling repeatedly throughout the 13 books we've read so far that Aristotle was forced into the cauldron of philosophy. Like famously, Plato also wasn't by choice a philosopher. He was a playwright until he happened upon Socrates, found his theories so compelling, so invigorating, so entrancing that he just burned up his plays and his writings and said, okay, philosophy it is, engagement in the mode of dialectic it is. And I have a rant to say about that as well, actually, which I'll get to. But yeah, I feel Aristotle similar, where he just had so much going for him that he just came across existent philosophies and said, nope, not having it, but also not having it. I'll have it, but in a very small dose, and I'll add to it and I'll make it better. And then he did.
I just picked up on something in what you said there, which is like perfectly poetic. That is the way that philosophers come into philosophy more often than not. You don't start out and try and get there by when you're a youngling, you've found philosophy super attractive. Like, no, you're out there playing, you're wrestling, you're picking a fight, you're doing something artistic, you're drawing, and you're being creative. And then philosophy arrives on the scene. You kind of encounter it in a certain way, and it just burns up everything there was before it. It just sublates it and subtracts it, and you realize, and this isn't something for all people, but this is, I think, for the person predisposed or having a predilection towards that philosophical encounter with life, that it just becomes the ever-present burning fire, right? It becomes the burning bush, when you yeah, interesting. But in interesting of the metaphoric analogy to the encounter with God on Mount, the top of the mountain, and the biblical text, and God being the I am that I am, and the burning bush that just is always burning yet never being self-consumed. I think it's a little bit of philosophy burns up the passions that you had before, and in a Platonic way, you kind of, leave the cave in a sense, and leave the shadowy figures of the realm of the world and enter into the realm of the forms, which give you that almost the intellected and spirited view of what things are in their being and their becoming. But isn't that just the metaphor for then what you have left is the ashes? You're carrying your ashes. Like, philosophy burns up your practices and interests before and creates ashes of all things. And then what's left for the philosopher but to play with the ashes in the hourglass, and to constantly carry them, and to constantly flip and change one's identity.
Yeah, and just to stick up for the philosophers here, like, not that it's all doom and gloom or that you're like just eviscerating them, but it's addition by subtraction, not subtraction ultimately. And philosophy, stepping into the cauldron, is also what takes you from self. I had this thing written down about tornadoes, how they're self-organizing, but they aren't self-making like humans, because tornadoes have a lot of similar features to human beings, but ultimately they're not. A tornado does not seek out constraints that promote its own growth, preservation, and well-being. Human beings do, and they do so very elegantly post a certain metanoic experience, and that generally is the refutation rather of everything that came hitherto.
Yeah. No, and I kind of say it as a compliment, but a inverted compliment to philosophers, it's almost like, when you see the flame, it is, it burns so brightly and changes and transforms you properly, such that when you go back to the things, they're not the things anymore, like they're ashes. And so, okay, what's left for you to do is nobly carry the ashes, uphill, downhill. It's interesting how there is that almost archetype within.
I've been feeling that so strongly and passionately this past week anyway, of, we have often said we judge a tree by the fruits it bears, but I almost feel like we should judge a tree by the fruits its grandchildren bears, or like the grand tree child, That's how far the ramifications and the proliferation of influence and cause should be. And so when you carry the ashes and you're honoring it in doing so, that's exactly what you're doing. Something is long and foregone, and then it's still being upheld, and that's how you know what the ashes really were. Only in in the future retrospect do we actually realize what the ashes ever were. We can't tell it in its lifetime. Famously, the quip of, the reason for increasing levels of neuroticism, anxiety, and meaninglessness is to do with no one wanting to plant a tree that they will not themselves sit under. That's very pervasive.
Yeah, I'll continue on with Zeta 1 and like a little, more directly respond to what Aristotle's saying in the text. In Zeta 1, he offers Eta 1, he offers a summary of what happens in Zeta. And it's interesting because in the summary, he also adds something new. He kind of slips in a new idea that wasn't really present in Zeta. And it's for that kind of disjunction and almost obvious manner that Aristotle makes here, that people would say that this is, contributed from perhaps multiple authors or at different times, or redacted in a way by his students, rather than that kind of strict linear text written. And what kind of comes in apart from the summary of, there's, what is substance is, quote, those generally recognized are the natural substances, i.e. earth, fire, water, air, and the simple bodies. Second, plants and their parts, and animals and the parts of animals. and finally the physical universe and its parts. So what he's saying there in his introduction of his recap of Zeta and introduction of Eta is, what's recognized, what we know as substance. And it's going back to the simple bodies, it's talking about the kind of elemental nature, plants and their parts, animals, and finally the physical things, almost giving that ordering of, like where he wants to show substance as existing, and then how we can define substance knowing that it exists there. He further in this recap goes on to, he comments about how, there's other schools of thought as well that say that forms and objects of matter are substances. And so he's like acknowledging Plato and Pythagoras in that. How he answers that later on in this book is sort of interesting, and I've been alluding to it at the start, which is sort of to say that mathematics and forms are properties of things that are substances, but are not themselves substances. They are abstractions. That's sort of where he comes down in like Zeta 6 in the final chapter. And I think it's interesting, and again, like it's part of Aristotle's dancing, and I feel like Aristotle just being inebriated by the campfire, coming up with like all these wicked thoughts and like being everywhere but nowhere at the same time, because he's just like, because he's zooming. It's, you can kind of get that quality where he's here and there, but also neither here nor there.
Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name.
Yeah. And so he starts a chapter by saying like, these are the things that, people commonly agree as substance and what we've kind of found. And then here are some other things that people do also think, but I'm not too sure of that. And he kind of gives that answer of how there is an essence in substance, and how that's related to its definition, almost that nesting of like being, substance, essence, definition. And since the essence is substance and the definition is a formula of the essence, for this reason we have discussed definition and essential predication. And so it's there that he synthesizes his reasons for talking about definition at length, and how there's a essential predication in the definition given there. So partly how he, I guess I'm wanting to do all that just to sort of intro me spiritually into this discussion in Eta, and what it also does is set up, where we're going, and then to directly respond to Protagoras. Like Protagoras is the one bringing in the point of how there's something that persists through change and through different kinds of change, that is something like, matter or substrate. And I think that's the point that Aristotle makes. And this is the point that Aristotle makes that wasn't entirely there in Zeta. And I think it's part of the reason why I would say that the matter is really important for Aristotle in a way where you couldn't, kind of depict form as the one word. And it's kind of strange how it just comes in, but he sort of makes a pivot here where he draws on matter as the explainer for what underlies change, and substance is something that underlies change. So he kind of makes that connection with matter and substance, and shows how matter is therefore like essential in substance. So he says from Zeta 1, I quote, "But clearly matter also is substance, for in all the opposite changes that occur, there is something which underlies the change." And the examples he gives after that is how there's change in place, change in quantity, and qualitative change that all can act on something and change how it appears or change its state, but not change the definitive essence of what something is. And so something could be here and then there, Something could grow or shrink in its life. Something could be healthy now but diseased later. Those are the examples he gives, and he wants to say that the matter of what they are, even though there's almost like a distinct change to the form of what something is, because the matter still persists, is what gives it its substantiality.
Absolutely. And on the topic of the essentiality of matter, that's where getting your definition correct of form is ultra important. He does kind of bifurcate form into relevant and irrelevant. Form is not merely appearance. Form is not the fact that a human body looks like a human body, because a living body, it looks like a human body, but so does a corpse, right? But one of them has form in a relevant sense and one in an irrelevant sense. And I wonder if that's just determined by your salience landscape, what is relevant and irrelevant, your field of awareness. But yeah, form is not to be conflated with appearance as it pertains to the subsistence of matter through different transitions. Form is more than that. Form is the structural functional organization, right? The principle by which the thing is intelligible as that thing.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where as we've been talking about before, where the almost door open to process metaphysics is, because the form of something is the structural functional organization. For Aristotle, it's maybe more of like that blueprint of what something is, or I mean, and for Aristotle, for Plato, to be fair to him, the eidos of something, like the drawn out relational field of potency that something has, is more like the form. Put that. And for Aristotle, it's more the structural functional organization. So that's where it's taking into consideration like that potentia, the matter that something is. And it's why, you know, functional, meaning how something behaves or acts in the world, it becomes important. If you take the example of an ear and kind of analyze its holomorphic structure, the ear is something that is able to hear sound, is part of what makes its form. It is a hearing entity, but also what like gives it its reality as a hearing entity is, you know, the tissue around it and the cochlea and the different cells that transmit, you know, the different like small hairs that hear these sound waves and transmit them into electromagnetic signals and send them to the brain and create that representation. It's just whack, to be honest. And it's all those like small material parts that are needed for sound to take place, for sound to be a qualitative experience. For the form of hearing to take place, you need all these different parts of the ear. And so there's a real interdependability in something like hearing that we can see from, right, this, how, you know, you can appreciate how form extends to structure and function, and how matter is absolutely constitutive in that makeup.
Quick interjection here. In the previous episode, I said that I wouldn't trust a single metaphysical treatise by a philosopher that didn't begin with a distinct glossary of neologisms. And one of the best books I ever read last year, actually, was called Music, the Brain, and Ecstasy, on screen now. And it began by a thorough study and analysis of the anatomy surgically of the ear, the canal, the vibrating hairs, the frequencies that allow sound to transmit and emit inwards and outwards. And that made me so assured that I was reading the right book, because if I want to study the brain, if I want to study music and the sensation and the feeling of ecstasy and catharsis and input and output, I have to know very theoretically how the ear functions. And I thought, yes, why isn't every book doing this? I thought I was reading a book about something completely else, but they said, we're not going to get into that until you understand how the ear works anatomically. And I just thought that's so perfect. So that's exactly like the carbs and physiology back and forth we've had repeatedly, where I'm not interested in the thing you have to say until you're very highly self-aware and cognizant of the makeup of the constituent parts.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, like start with the material cause and then get me to the final cause, but I will not begin until you walk me through the material.
It's like the hot girl thing. She doesn't have to be only, she can't be only hot, but I'm not looking at her unless she's hot. But then, yeah, no, hotness does not suffice, but lack of hotness absolutely does not suffice as a starting point. So there's that as well.
There you go, and beauty's in the eye of the beholder. So don't get down on yourself if Sid doesn't think you're hot, because I'm sure there's someone who does think you're hot. Hot is relational anyway.
Everything good's relative.
Cool.
Cool, man. Next, Ida.
Ida too. One thing I do want to map out here is that connection from Aristotelian metaphysics to contemporary theories of physics, almost like materialism if you were being charitable to materialism. So I'd like to just map this out a little bit. Kind of to a materialist ontology, where I had the thinking of this because it came up in our last discussion, almost to think of substrate as like a quantum flux, as something that persists throughout any kind of change and ultimately is giving rise, but it's also something that just sits idly by. Like you can do Newtonian mechanics and get to the moon without quantum physics. It's ultimately just lying by. It's not the total criteria for substance in a way. And this is partly why Aristotle needs definability in his notion of substance and not just materiality stripped of any quality. Because if you have materiality stripped of quality, you have substrate, which in this analogy is like quantum fields or underlying physical state spaces. You don't actually need that to get to the moon. You don't need that to really discover the structural, functional organization. You don't need that to be in contact with reality, but it is necessary for reality to be. But with substance, he's wanting to see the definable and the differentiable qualities of something. He's wanting to get us to that level. He's not satisfied to just go to like pure quantum flux in a sense. So it's like a first point to make there. In this analogy, substance and that which is the beingness of something, the presence, is what I would think about as stable, individuated physical entities. So this is like your particles, atoms, molecules, organisms, things that can be differentiated, things that have a kind of structural intactness and integrity, but you're still at the very building blocks of what something is. And I think to close the loop on a thing I was saying before was how this discussion of using quantum physics as an analogy for substrate came up in the discussion. And then as I was thinking about it, I just wanted to take that further and try and find more of the metaphorical grasp to this and see if it, carried through. So you can be the judge if it holds. The third concept was the essence that we discussed in this trinity of codependence, yet internal insubstantiality. Like reflecting on itself, it negates itself. But if it reflects on itself by presencing the other, then it is formal and it's real. Essence, toti and I, that which was to be, that almost this concept which, there's no real translation for essence, but what we call essence is almost that which was to be of something. Like that's the strict definition of toti and I. And in this, it would be the organizing structure or identity conditions of a thing. So it would be a little bit like the electromagnetism that is at play in an atom or an organism. It would be something like, the atomic number of what there is, the molecular structure, like the energetic bonds between a hydrogen or like a water molecule, that there's something constituted in how, and it takes place in a variety of ways. The essence of different things is different, but it is kind of the constitutor, the glue of the substance of what something is. And that's why it's between that dialectic of the substance and the essence of something that you find the substrate. It's between seeing how the atoms and molecules themselves interact with the electromagnetic and the bioelectric fields that they're within, that gives you the view of, okay, the quantum that's in the background, that is actually at play and at present. And understanding the quantum gets you that kind of link between them. So to my way of thinking, it's a little bit of, and I'll maybe just finish with an example on like a couple of material things. But yeah, this is my way of bringing and applying Aristotelian metaphysics to a materialist ontology that has at least a decent reading of it, not a opposite of a steel man, not a straw man that so many spiritual and religious people want to give materialists today. So if we think about like water, you would say it's material substrate. The substrate would just be the quantum fields and particles and the flux there. Like that is the thing that stays pretty similar between. If we also go and look at a material like gold, we get the quantum flux and fields and particles that is just the base layer. But then for water, it would be the H2O molecules. For gold, it would be the gold atoms. And then the essence for water would be that the bonding relations of a water molecule, and its sort of characteristic capacities. Like if you look at it at scale, like how wetness, having the quality of wetness would be part of it. And for gold, it would almost be like the atomic number of 79, the nuclear structure that makes it gold. So there's that real interweaving of substance and essence there. So yeah, I would put that forward. Curious on your thoughts and reflections, and it's not something that I'm trying to establish as a baseline, but I think it does give us a helpful way to, with the current Geist, the current spirit of todayness, of what is metaphysically accepted as mainstream within science, and connect that back to Aristotelian logic.
Yeah, and I think someone like Newton is the perfect go-between there. And I'd love to speak about how all Aristotle, Newtonian mechanics, and kind of the presupposed subject-object distinction and Cartesian dualism all fits in together. We don't want to straw man any version of materialism. The best and the classic argument against philosophical idealism would be that it's self-contradictory to claim that reality is solely a product of the mind. It is a product of the mind because my phenomenology admits of it, but it's not solely a product of the mind because the mind is based in reality. So idealism presupposes realism, and I know realism is not synonymous with materialism, but high degree of overlap, you could say. But one thing that Newtonian mechanics and the three laws and stuff that everyone learns in high school as a starting point overprivileges and overemphasizes is the influence of causes as being causal over constraints being causal. So that's a point that I've thought about a few times. Causes for us as modern and postmodern and post-postmodern techno-feudal beings, causes for us are events that make things happen, so are more closely and readily associated with actuality. Constraints are conditions that make things possible, but not actually make things happen. They make things possible in theory, so closely associated with modern and 101 readings of Aristotelian potentiality. So the example would be that there's ample space in front of the pen for it to roll towards when I push it. So the form is the cause is me pushing it, but we don't think that something else that caused the pen to roll forward is the fact that there is ample space in front of it. The constraint for some reason gets diminished and isn't treated as a cause. And this is a modern sickness and ailment. I don't think someone in Aristotle's time would overprivilege ego consciousness in this way. which itself is rather counterintuitive, because we spoke of metaphysics as the pinnacle of human study and endeavor, and for that you need to assume that there is possibility of access to underlying reality. For that you have to assume that the human being is capable and possible and perhaps perfectly poised to embark on such an endeavor. So privileging of the man, but then somehow they don't afford that same privilege to the subject object distinction. So no, I see a lot of worth in what you're saying. I see a lot of unworth in post-Newtonian mechanics and how that's just completely infiltrated and arguably contaminated lower versions of subjective takes on materialism as well. And then we've spoken in previous episodes about enabling and disabling constraints. That's something that's really Darwinian as well, and applies to natural and sexual selection. So when it comes to reproduction, there are enabling constraints like variation, he says, and then disabling constraints. He doesn't use this terminology. He uses virtual governor and virtual generator. The virtual generator is that there is variation upon reproduction. The virtual governor is that there's a scarcity of resources that reduces options. So there's like a clean bifurcation and split that seems to be highly symptomatic and emblematic of our times. And yeah, it's just one of those classic catch-22s of like, it's there, it makes sense, but it's just so dead and raw and dry, you know? So I see so much sense in what you're saying, but the problem with what you're saying is that I only see sense.
Yeah, so where's the catch? Where's the where's the nonsense? Yeah, well, I think it's interesting to think with this, and it's kind of just a analogous scheme to help modernize, and even like this would be a way to bring Aristotle to to academy and to physicists in a way to kind of find that the conjunctions. I think like almost this episode could be called like, what is the spirit of matter? Because we are finding the spirit of matter, and what, like, even if we use this to go and think about technology and how we're trying to imbue matter with spirit through technology through today, but somewhere that I was also going with what you were speaking was, how far can materialism extend to Aristotle's causes from this picture, and I think it's in this series we've kind of almost, in a way characterized sciences, and modern materialist science is only willing to go as far as the material cause, that it can't speak to these other areas of inquiry like the, efficient cause, formal cause, final cause. But if we actually put it under the microscope, we can at least see the ways in which it does have a influence and hold in these other areas, but it's just not the only thing. It's just not reducible to that. The form of something is not reducible to its matter. Aristotle has made his whole philosophy based around that the form is this separate entity which kind of gives rise to like almost like that spiritual concept in our mind. But yeah, I'm almost thinking about the material now in almost like the materialist, like the cellular components, the atomic components, the electric components of matter and energy, and how close can that go to giving us the becauses of something, like why something happened or why change, why this event took place, why this actual occasion ingressed in the present moment, like why, and to use Whiteheadian language, why this moment of experience happened in the way it did with these events transpiring and taking place constantly. The scientist is trying to explain change and causation and the why, the what of things. Science is all about trying to predict and explain like what's happening. And yeah, if we just have a broader kind of category of materialism as is accepted in science today, then it has such a big role to play in these different areas of movement and change of things with Newton's laws of mechanics, with the formal causes, looking at an atom, looking at a cell, we can see its structural functional organization, and we can really deduce it to these this field of electromagnetic gradients and compounds and proteins all kind of reacting with each other in this way that just creates intelligence from the bottom up. And when we think to the material cause, like that's its wheelhouse. So the only thing that I'm kind of left wondering is, does it have a significant thing to say about the final cause? How does the final cause show up and manifest in a material way? The final cause is the purpose of something and what it is. And I'm almost wondering, like, the way that the final cause and the final cause of being the unmoved mover at the start of it all, that we'll get to in Aristotle, but the kind of thought I'm having at the moment is the material version of the final cause, like just the Big Bang. And how is there a sense of final destination achieved in complete, infinitely small potentia through the moment just before the Big Bang? So that's like almost some thoughts on that as well. There's an article that Rupert Sheldrake wrote called "Is the Sun Conscious?" and it's this panpsychist view of this. And with what you were saying before about the tornado not being autopoietic, it doesn't seek out, I think you said constraints. I think it's it's constraints and conditions of its own existence. So it's not seeking out how it can eat food, like eat a house. No, it's kind of just a construct of these forces and conditions of the material world in an extended material sense, where we're also looking at the energy and electromagnetic atmosphere, the air atoms and the friction created in them, etc., to create this something that has, as you said, almost human characteristics. It has a center of itself. It has a kind of containment in its own unity. If we extend that to something like the sun, Rupert Sheldrake even goes on to say, the complex electromagnetic fields function similarly to brainwaves, that it is really just this, like, there's a lot more equivalence of neuronal synapses in the sun than the brain by a mile. When you look at the kind of creative mixture of what's happening in the sun. And he's sort of making the hypothesis that, based on a panpsychist view, the sun regulates its activities based on the solar system and is in relation to all these things. So it's because the sun is intensely self-organizing and is the source of energy of our solar system. So there's at least some speculation that I think is fruitful there, even if the question is not to answer, is the sun conscious? But that is the starting point to get us to a more holistic and embedded worldview. And I think, like, for me, that's partly, almost trying to give another way to answer, like, how far we can take materialism when we get to ask the question of the final cause. Could the sun be conscious? Could it be a self-authoring agent?
Wow. Yeah, that was packed, man. That was packed. You gave us an absolute spanking. Well done. But we're here for it because we're masochists. And yeah, man, the ways in which things are true fractally constantly befuddles and baffles me when you see the same. And I think that's what I was trying to get at unknowingly with the tool Fibonacci sequence thing, where how can something that is an observable, knowable, inductible pattern in my sense awareness and sense making apparatus also coincide and meaningfully exist in some far off thing on the other side of the world and in a entity that I don't relate to? How can plants grow in a way, or like have their own ecosystem and like set of ecologies that somehow coheres with the way that humans self-develop, you know. And this kind of thing, it's very confusing for me because it enamors me. I love hearing it, but I also think it's a compulsion and sickness of the knowable cosmos fallacy. And it's the old theological insistence we've seen in, you know, different way after different way repeatedly, of treating underlying reality as something that's there for us. You know, it's just there, and things are ultimately, I don't know what the word is, but like we're in the, I think it's the tyranny of the dialectical ultimately. Like the, you know, we don't want to straw man, we don't want to straw man materialism. We don't want to steel man the dialectic as well. It's
Mm.
worth noting how much of vitalistic health existed in the pre-Socratics, right? As a result of being pre-Socratic, um, Socrates deliberately asked of his disciples to abstain from unphilosophical stimuli, as he called it. Um, you know, that's kind of like as part of that same story of Plato burning down his writings. I have a lot to say on this, but do you want to say something there?
Well, I am curious, like the tyranny of the dialectical, but and
Yeah.
pointing to the pre-Socratic, but yeah, Socrates being like the master of the dialectical, and he's someone that like many philosophers look up to, dialectical or not.
Yeah, and I'm saying that that's the stain on him. Like that's not the glowing, gleaming reputation that it gets taken to be, I think, because we talked about deterministic versus dialectical relations and modes of operation within philosophy, but it's not like one is good, the other's bad, or anything like that. But when something has this high infusion of dialecticism and becomes the art form, like we see in Plato's writings, that means a usurping of the old guard being tragedy, right? So there is some trade-off here. We don't have noble aristocratic tragedy anymore, the kind that Nietzsche venerates of Euripides. Yeah, Euripides, so repeatedly. And this kind of brings us perfectly back to the modern age of needing everything to reconcile. We spoke in that metaphysics of adjacency little section of inability for things to remain incomplete, and incompleteness as a feature of a thing, or incoherence as a feature of a thing as well as a structural organization. There's this need to rejoice in a conclusion and in a reconciliation that stems from dialecticalism. Well, not doesn't stem from it, but it can be readily associated with it. I'm quoting here: the optimistic element in the dialectic only breeds happiness in a conclusion upon clarity and consciousness, right? So again, not much love for the pre and post conscious. Virtue is knowledge. All sins arise from ignorance. Ignorance, of course, they're going to dub into the same category as unconscious, right? Because even you put a Jungian lens on this, all of the maps and heuristics of self-development are running in tandem with bringing to consciousness that which is currently unconscious. Bring it out, better out than in, expression rather than inexpression, to use the Confession and Foucaultian terminology. Virtue is knowledge. All sins arise from ignorance. The virtuous man is the happy man, means the hero is now dialectical and no longer tragic. So yeah, I attribute a lot of this to the sickness and the compulsions that adhere to the knowable cosmos fallacy, as I've heard it described. And you see this in the Newtonian mechanics world we were speaking about as well, where physicists have their own version of the true world and the world of forms, where the ultimate substrate is actually atoms, and even like cells. Like a cell is just a coalition of subcellular structures governed by this universal objective law that is ultimately deterministic. So, and what makes it the physicist's version of the true world is that it's observer independent. It's a reality that exists outside of our ability to observe and perceive it, and have our senses adapted or maladapted to this underlying reality. So yeah, ultimately, like, truth is veritas, correspondence between mind and world. But then that's when the transhuman and the impersonal make their marauding entry, where it turns out, yeah, every entity in reality is, we've said this before, but every entity in reality is constructing reality, not just for itself, but of itself and for reality itself, grappling and refashioning. And you even think of again, to be observer independent. You think of a chemical, how it reacts when a human's watching versus how it's when a human's not watching, but it's still, something's always happening. It's always responding to an external stimuli in accordance with its chemicalness, whatever that means. So I do have a lot of admiration for Socrates' lack of adoration with, at his time, the natural philosophers, and how a lot of them provided what he said was, I got this from Viveki, but how they provided truth without relevance. So truth without the capacity to transform. So the core central problem that Socrates is addressing of self-deception and ridding ourselves of it remains. Then you have the sophists, who we've also derided in previous episodes, who provide us with relevance without truth. How do we get the golden ratio of both? How does the thing that we find salient also inevitably and irrevocably help us move us towards the path of truth? And your question was, how did we get here? We got here because I think in the previous epoch, we were doing that catchphrase that me and you both love, which is imbuing matter with spirit. Now what we're doing is correcting matter with spirit. And there's like a even stronger supremacy of the ego consciousness as the center of being, rather than just the center of our being. So, and I quote, "Rational thought, guided by causality, can penetrate to the depths of being, and that it is capable of not only knowing, but also correcting being is our greatest sickness." So, yeah, any thoughts on that, my good man?
Any thoughts? God damn. You just hit me with a baseball bat. Thank you for that. There was a lot of really potent points in there. There were so many one-liners which are deserving of an essay at the least. I first want to ask you who that quote was from when you said that initially. And giving him 1 second, I'm gonna continue to riff. I thought, like, yeah, I have a question of, is the tyranny, I guess, yeah, no, just to like respond to that, I was hearing how the dialectic almost privileges consciousness in a way, and I think that that's certainly what we sort of get from like Aristotle and Hegel, where, you know, the dialectic eventuates in absolute knowing and, you know, kind of knowledge of the concept, and it's also knowledge of one's limitation. So I guess Hegel also, you know, and preserving like Christ as essentially one of the foremost examples of the completed dialectic is a tragic story. So in some ways within the dialectic you still have the tragic. But firstly, who was that quote from? Was it Nietzsche?
I don't know. It was in my notes. I just have no idea.
What? No, cool. It sounded like Nietzsche.
If we don't know, then we just say Tesla, right?
Shit, could have just been one of those dudes. Well, it sounds like the birth of tragedy to me. Like the Apollonian on the scene negates the Dionysian, and you get the favoring of consciousness and knowledge over this, you know, ecstasy and tragedy.
Yeah, it could have been.
But like, I think, yeah, for you, does it feel like the tyranny of the dialectical is synonymous with the tyranny of the conscious, like over the unconscious?
Yeah, I would say painting with a broad stroke, yes. I have a like full thing I can say on that, but the short answer would be yes. So you finish this thought, then I can speak more on that.
Yep. No, I mean, I think I just want to like, I guess I'm pushing back a little to, yeah, really, I guess, paint with like more finer strokes and see like where that's coming down on, like in what ways, like what is it about the dialectic where the weakness or the trade-off is, so that we can, you know, be conscious of our, you know, decision and discernment there. I almost, because I think dialectical thinking as well offers you the ability to kind of reconcile that. And I think for someone like Aristotle, who is, you know, a master dialectician, and why Hegel was such a big, fan of his, he also still holds the belief that the highest form of poetry is the tragic because it is the truest representation of the human condition. Like the tragic is the Dasein. And so I feel like you still have the door open for, the Dionysian flood within a dialectical mode of thinking.
I don't see that in Hegel, actually. I see, his famous maxim of like the end of history, like is I think that gets
Yeah.
misappropriated as the end of time. Yeah,
It's the end of history as we know it, because to fully understand Hegel is to burn the rest of your life, right? It's to change it into ashes, and now you're working with a new frame where the old you has to transform and has to come to a new way of seeing and understanding in the Hegelian, nature. So there's like a way in which that quote is a little bit misinterpreted, and it's almost like, I've finally mastered history, I can control it, I'm the self-authoring agent. But really it's just to say the whole like prehistory of thought that you had now you have to depart from that to enter and learn like Hegelian dialectic.
but isn't for Hegel freedom very interchangeable with consciousness and like a true consciousness and the birth of consciousness? And when we say the end of history, isn't that really just the end of unconscious operatives governing factors?
Well, in a sense, but it's also the end of like pre-conscious governance factors, and it's the end of conscious governance factors, and then it's the end of transconscious governance factors, because it continually evolves and spirit continually moves towards an end, which is a complete reconciliation of like the conscious and the unconscious. Like it's that complete realization of the contradiction.
Yeah, so I guess to go back to your initial question about if I see space in the dialectic for what's the question? Unconscious, like, or like space for newness, or what would you say the tail end of that is? Or for the tragic?
I think this is a rich and meaningful pause. don't don't edit it out. Because we're in very fertile grounds right now. I guess there's not like a discernible question I'm asking. Like I'm thinking with you, but also wanting to, like not. I guess I'm wanting to, really like stress test this concept of dialectic, because I think you do bring a very valid, like it's a very meaningful and important consideration of like naturally all things have a trade-off for something else. Like when we're thinking dialectically, it means we're not thinking with certainty, or we're not thinking with stability in a way. So like I understand there's a trade-off, and maybe that uncertainty and instability is something that we lose when we go to Socrates, and we lose the tragedy, because we now think that we can think through everything and it's going to be okay. But everything that has ever been thought has only been thought by people that were alive.
But not necessarily conscious, right? Most of thinking happened before the co-development with language in this form.
But I want to say like that death is never thought. Death is unable to be thought, because once you're dead, then that conscious mind in the human capacity ceases. And so we, in our philosophy, have privileged the Apollonian, because the Dionysian, death, destruction, fragmentation, ecstasy, when you encounter that in the full way, you die.
Yes, you do die.
And so the dialectic ends, and there, like, dialectic doesn't resolve shit.
I see what you're saying, but I think that what you are saying when you say consciousness is closer to the faculty of meta consciousness or second order thinking. Would that be correct? The ability to think about the fact that I'm thinking and reflect. And I'm talking more about that as well, in the sense of it's contemplative man that's closer to the ailment or the malady than simply conscious man. Because conscious man, there are things that go hand in hand with that, like sentience. But I'm speaking more of the man who's aware that he's conscious.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, I think there's like a certain energy and drive within consciousness that it's helpful to, like, as see as what the unfolding of it is, and like criticisms about that because it is the driving force of something. But yeah, as we know, there's kind of different nuances in the way that we can ultimately define and conceive of consciousness, and it's like where we want to draw that limit or line probably depends a lot about, like, will determine a lot of the discussion that unfolds.
And that quote now, that would have been from Birth of Tragedy, because all the other thoughts I'm getting about this are very Nietzschean, where he speaks in Twilight of the Idols. Let me find it. In places where authority is in the right place, the dialectician is a buffoon. People don't demonstrate but command. I was speaking about this before as well, about something to do with expropriation found in Machiavelli's The Prince, right? You happen across a piece of land that you're authorized to take. Imagine if you carried the truth in your hands, like we spoke about last episode. That's something that I really, really synonymize with consciousness, is carrying truth in your hands, being ready upon command, upon instruction to, like, a dissolution of the instincts as well is something that I would say is more symptomatic of our age, and this variation and instantiation of consciousness. And that's where the trade-off lies, the deep trade-off of like form versus instinct, instinct versus like theoretical instruction, Rocky's come up versus the pinnacle versus the come down, that type of energy.
Yeah. And is it like, is that not,
and that's done out of fear of, I think that's done out of fear of the supremacy of our instincts when left unhinged. There's such a reining in of the faculties, and yeah, like ultimately it's an operative that runs more out of fear than love, to use Forrest Landry's little thing. And it also, it emphasizes needlessly, I would argue, sense impressions, where this one, like dream analysis, you would think, this happened in the 3rd hour of my sleep last night, and I'm going to fixate on this rather than the 6th hour. Why? Why does one have to be more potent than the other? And it's not to advocate an ataraxia or a ambivalence as to which sense impression should be given more of your time and energy, but it's that it will foreground itself to you. It'll emphasize and exalt itself to you. You don't need to like put on this theoretician's hat and go out and conduct scientific study. And the other thing is, there's a difference between conscious and unconscious, and within the unconscious, the reactive and the active, as Deleuze puts it, right? There's a lot to say about here, but I was going to say all this stuff about forgetfulness and memory and the sickness of remembering things, if you want me to do that now, but otherwise respond to that
let's go there next. I just want to say a part as well. And I take this discussion and analogy from voicecraft discussion that happened recently. It was about superposition in the political economy. Just like a real amalgamation of like ideas. Like, it's insane why this is coming up. But I think I want to just put the question and to kind of demonstrate your point. Does the caterpillar turn into a butterfly by instinct, or by like language that it, by rationality, by conscious faculty? Like, the transformation to the butterfly happens from the cells up, happens from the soul up, and you aren't required some privileged notion of consciousness such as it was in the 18th and 19th centuries when Nietzsche was writing to get to that level of transformation. And I think it just demonstrates how, when we favor reason, I think maybe the tyranny of the dialectical is, for me, maybe a bit more appropriate is the tyranny of reason. And I would probably equate dialecticality to a higher class that is the ultimate way that, for instance, Nietzsche was able to write a book like that and come up with an idea and a concept like that. So I would, want to, like, if we're talking more about reason, then I'm a lot more comfortable and think it's easier to define and determine the limits. I think, yeah, reason is,
I
for
think
me, as just someone kind of entrenched in Hegel quite a lot, that I just, see that as like quite a, quite a decent concept.
Yeah, absolutely. I think reason is a much easier opponent though, when dismissing this, because I feel like it's more there for the taking. Where yeah, like if we're just theory selling about this, then yeah, reason can be annihilated right then and there.
Well, but reason is rationality, and is, I still also hold in very high regard, but I think it is a bit truer to like the Descartes of the world and the Kants, who were, very focused on like writing their magnum opus down and getting their thoughts on a page and having that take us forward and show us to the new, the new way and the new world of things. And so I feel like it's less of a straw man than we might think.
I would bring up the Heidegger hammer thing we often bring up in this type of scenario, where, yes, one part of it is that when you pick up the hammer, everything looks like a nail because it becomes a fifth limb and it becomes immediately incorporated. But the other thing is that we only recognize it and feel it in our subjective conscious experience as a hammer when it ceases to be a hammer. And that's what I was getting at with the melody of consciousness, is things only become conscious to you when they're in a senescent or degenerate state. And so they're not to be structured by default because they've been made conscious to you, and in worse occasions, very conscious to you, super conscious to you, because something needs correcting. And that's also more evolutionarily why we have these faculties. Like, it's there for a reason, and that reason I think has been lost along the way. And I know you're saying reason is very to be distinguished from the mode of operation that is the dialectic, but yeah, do you have anything on that first?
Yeah, how do we really realize reason? Like, what is the real realization of reason? And it's not like we shouldn't, have the tyranny of reason. It shouldn't be something that comes in and says, okay, all of this development and instinct and, cognition that it's built on has all been to actualize reason. Like, it's the fruit of the tree, and we can just pluck it and eat it and enjoy it and, relish in the splendor of our humanities, when really like the tree and the instinct and the pre-conscious is all there and all necessary to give birth to the apple. And so the more naturalized and I think even way that Schelling would think about this is, human consciousness is the apple of a tree, but it's appreciating the fullness of the earth and the roots and the bark and the trunk and the leaves and the branches that are all necessary to give rise to that apple. So yeah, I like.
But you can't give into that experience if you're conscious of it, right? It's only in the fleeting glimmers and glimpses where you're unconscious of it where sensation actually takes hold, right? If you're thinking about you eating an apple, you're not eating the apple.
Yep.
Or do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree.
Okay. The other thing I was going to say, this was a really beautiful quote I found during the week, was blessed are the forgetful because they get the better even of their blunders. But the difference, I think the difference I'm kind of hearkening to here is like the difference between the Faustian spirit of the West, maybe less so today, maybe even more so today, but in like really concentrated pockets of hyper Faustianness. Thinking of the pseudo versions like the Peter Thiels, but then maybe more legitimate versions emerging in pockets attempting to steal culture, if you will. But the core idea of the Promethean myth that kind of goes alongside this of imbuing, I don't know if that's the right word, giving.
I mean, the Promethean myth is, like correcting matter with spirit. Like it's kind of what you shared before. And it's like, and this was the other part I wanted to speak to a little of. And it's, we're trying to correct matter with spirit. And what if matter was already corrected and it was just our spirit that was misaligned and felt like, oh, we have to do something to matter. We have to do something to the natural world. We have to try.
Yes, why would we need to be conscious unless we think that there is some matter to be corrected? That's what I was trying to get at, but I didn't know. Do you know what I mean? Like, if it's only by misdefault that we end up in a situation where we are needing corrective mechanisms, what about the world as an aesthetic existence needs correcting? And this was famously Nietzsche's retraction, right, from The Birth of Tragedy, when he said it smells offensively Hegelian. I don't know what it was, but it's now I've realized it. It's offensively Hegelian, because the core one quote he takes away from The Birth of Tragedy is, "It is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that life justifies itself." And then he thought, no, that's wrong, but I don't know why. And then he thought, because life doesn't need to justify itself. Life is the justification of existence. And so when the only reason to be an active participant, in the sense of being, not in the Deleuzian sense, but an active conscious participant, is when there is a need for remedy, which there isn't. That's what was wrong with The Birth of Tragedy, he said later on.
Well, this is all smelling frightfully Nietzschean.
Hey, he can say it, you can't say it.
Yeah.
But that's the
Yeah,
apple.
no, I think there's
Yeah.
something that does speak to a lot of, like the modern instinct to be so obsessional and confessional about the material, when really, like, and part of the change that's happening, like part of this, microcurrent and shift that's already happening, where there was this big AI boom, and now all of a sudden all these AI startups are failing, but like still the economy in America is like, absolutely excelling for this AI optimism that's had. Like the markets are really big on this AI thing. It seems like we're finally, and markets is like a great, there's so much that's going into something like the stock market, so many experts talking and discussion and people seeing it, and like our collective truth making is the markets in a sense. And like we are only going to put our money, we're going to put our money where our mouth is, if we think it can return money for us from a market perspective. And because it's so big, it means that we are actually all in on this in a sense. And yeah, I'm kind of like wondering about that tension where it simultaneously works but then fails, but then has a much bigger ambition behind it. So it's not like the failure of all these AI startups are showing that something has failed, but it's showing that that first attempt to kind of materialize and like correct matter wasn't exactly it. But we can still see this way of, we can almost create computation to correct matter, and create intelligence to connect to matter. Like we don't become the technological singularity, we make the technological singularity. And it's like the AI computers and cloud and software that takes us to Mars and the moon. Like we don't go extraterrestrial, we send the robots to go extraterrestrial.
As we said off camera, diversify risk, right? Why do something when you can make your lackey slave do it? But yeah, I think we're draping with fantasy things that we barely understand, which is exactly what we should be doing and what we naturally have a predilection to do. And yes, that's very much the case with AI in its nascent form, I feel. It's like, I don't know why the detractors of AI seem to think that its failures are emblematic of its ultimate degeneration or ultimate finish and fall. That's just the nature of anything in its nascent form. It has to start off as a caricature of the zeroed in version it once will be. And one way we know that it will be a more refined version of itself is that it isn't now. The fool is the precursor to the savior, even for things that are gaining more and more humanity that aren't human.
Are the fools that are the precursor to the savior those that are working in OpenAI and experimenting with this and really devoting their drive to code and computation to kind of crack the source code of intelligence?
Yes, but not for the reason you might think. They're fools because they think the world needs saving. It's a superiority complex of
But
can we
do they
redeem?
like? Do they like? Are they not just interested in and motivated by the the flight of sciences? Like when I listen to interviews by maybe Zuckerberg, but maybe less so, like Sam Altman and the CEO of Nvidia, like they seem sincere and kind of well grounded in what they're doing in a sense. And I mean, history only will tell the story of whether that holds up or whether there's a scandal or something that comes if there's a sickness that we see. But it seems like they are people that people really get behind and back through their investment. So they're putting their true belief towards them.
Are you
And
trolling, by the way? I can't tell if this is an intricate, ironic
I'm
spiel.
not trolling. What do you mean? Am I trolling?
The Sam Altmans of this world in their interviews are grounded. You said, is that like, are you being serious?
Yeah.
Genuinely, like this is not. Yeah,
Like
are you?
he doesn't he like
He like
Zuckerberg.
he believes it, right?
But I'm saying like, yeah, are we thinking that okay, we're getting the sense from him that there is a sickness in humanity that needs to be cured? Like, are we not just getting some nerd who loves his craft? And he's trying to justify that love by getting on camera and say we need it, it's to connect us all, we're going to make jobs hyper efficient. Like, is he not just trying to push his drive further and further? And is that not the fall that's the precursor to the savior? That's like just
Yeah, yeah. That's a good reworking of it, actually. Yeah, I think any human being alive, well, I guess in this case, male, wants to drench the world in his semen, and I think that's his version of doing that in all of our foul logocentric glory. And yeah, no, it's just maximal self-expansion in the way in which it manifests to you in a highly subjective, personalized way. And for him, that looks like everyone screaming his name and having unlimited money, and more power to him for that.
And I think as well, yeah, like I guess there is some like moral like connotations with it, and
No,
ultimately that's
no, there aren't.
no, but within like the guise of the ethical status and choices that Sam Altman's making, like there's it's kind of quick to moralize, and like everyone hates on Elon Musk nowadays and for similar things. But yeah, I almost want to be careful to how we properly dialecticize technology, not to reason technology, but how we dialecticize it is to like not place a moral lens on like technology. Like it's very much worth considering the direction that AI is going and applying the ethical lens, but to really work with technology and understand it fully in that capacity is to kind of think through the ramifications of it in a way where we're not trying to make it go somewhere or be of a certain position, so to not moralize its integration with humanity too quickly.
But what I would say to that is we don't need to reach a point of technological singularity to already be at the mercy of its determinisms. Like I think we overestimate our own autonomy here. Like it's what's going to happen is going to happen. And
Yeah.
I wonder if it's that same savior complex stepping back in.
And I guess then if it is to happen, if the caterpillar is to turn to a butterfly, are we, and I mean this brings in Aristotle as well, are we creating it through a natural or artificial process? And because it's artificial, it means the material doesn't define what it is. So we can create, AI out of synthetic carbon, out of, these AI bots, like self-driving cars is AI, the Tesla bots is AI, large language models is AI, all different substrates and material components that are, being working and forming around this intelligence. But I guess my question is, and this goes back to the text Eda very closely, is the way that there are some instances of substance, like the car and the robot and the computer software that do house a kind of substance, but it's not produced from a natural way, it's produced from an artificial way. There is a human techne, a human craft and art that is creating the substance of what something is. So we humans have this agency to be creators of substance. And with that agency, we weld insane power. We are, with the technology and the creation of the atomic and hydrogen bombs, where we weld the power of gods, but for the wisdom. So we don't have the wisdom to weld these godlike tools that could wipe out humanity, right? That could be I guess, we're getting all dialectical and we're thinking that, we're going to be egalitarian and able to diplomatically talk things through with different countries. But then, like, what if there's a third world war? What if the Dionysian comes crashing back and we lose this privileged, conscious, Apollonian, dialectical anything, and we just get, a burnt out Earth? Like, that's, I guess, the next ultimate Dionysian event singularity that someone like Eric Weinstein has been, totally concerned with. That Jordan Peterson, that started his whole career essentially, was this insane fear of the possibility of total destruction. And so it is that next thing that is spawning real thinkers of today, like thinkers of technology and of potential destruction and damnation. And my thought there is, as we are kind of artists of form and able to create new substance, as the caterpillar transforms into the butterfly and we're able to create that kind of transformation through our own technological invention, I guess, like, where does that put us? What is the butterfly that's created going to be? This mortific creature? Is it going to be the horror of the zombie, that we bring something to life, but we bring something that is sick and decaying because we were trying to correct matter with spirit, and so we were operating from our own sick and decaying form of instinct?
Really fertile questions, man. Yeah, that sparked a lot for me for this little closing salvo. What I'd say is this is the latest version when we speak of the Eric Weinsteins of this world, of the priest turned psychologist turned pseudo-intellectual, wanting to diagnose the zeitgeist in their way, imbuing their eschatology. We have original sin, we have the fall. I said in one of the initial episodes, we're experiencing and living through Christianity on steroids, if you see it as such. And if you're not privy to these patterns, then you're not, and you literally won't experience life that way. I do. And what I see is nothing more than Judgment Day calling and a lot of, tremors and panic attack type things that launch careers, like in the case of Jordan Peterson. And nothing more or less than that. So I actually think we don't need to overestimate our influence or our impact in our day-to-day more than we can actually feasibly recognize. Something we've got completely bass backwards is thinking that the person who cannot foresee anything beyond a 2-meter radius of themselves is unhealthy, when it's the precise opposite. You should not be worried about you can't worry about what's happening across the world, and so you should not be pretending like you are and virtue signaling.
How does that last part of what you said relate to people that would be concerned and take up the problem of like potential world end?
No, that's what I'm saying. I think they're not doing that. That's the image.
Yeah, right. That it's not virtue signaling because they're not making a fuss of, like some other forms of virtue signaling.
No, I'm saying it's not possible to conceptualize the world end the way we think it is, because you're conveniently leaving out the majority of factors and variables and externalities that one human being cannot literally biologically compute. That's why we need a computer with scattered cognition and distribution. A human being can't think about the world ending without themselves dead. So like when someone claims to do that, I'm immediately skeptical, and not even skeptical. I have a conclusion.
But are you like skeptical of like Eric Weinstein's motivation then?
I'm not skeptical in the sense that I'm doubting it. I think he's trying to make a career for himself and is doing so.
Yeah, but like the career that he's making is, where he goes is kind of reinventing mathematics to try and give us his and what I'm hearing you say is like, we can never understand the totality of what something is, especially insofar as it's something like complete world end. We must impose an ideology to explain it in the Zizekian sense. But for like Weinstein, he's, his career comes from his, contributions to mathematics and, capital management, which is kind of separate. Like he's a polymath. But and I'm wondering, like, it's, to me, seems like he has a very sincere motivation of like care partly through his own, if we psychoanalyze him in a way that he also like talks to us about, like the Jewish tradition of needing a way out, like always wanting to know where the doors are in a room, kind of thing, for
Yeah.
for when death does come to your door, in the form of German military in the 40s. So there's that ingrained learning that is perhaps more than just that, virtue signaling, but is like virtue honoring.
That's one way to put it. The other way is continuing a very unproud tradition of your ancestors and not just coming up with something new. Why do these traces and remnants have to persevere and persuade our thinking? Like, why can't he break out of that? Is my more immediate concern. And also,
Well,
like,
his way to
if you're conceiving of the end of the world, surely you should be more in shape first of all before making, like that's Jordan Peterson, right? Clean your room before worrying about waving a sign. Why is he not fit?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I
And
mean,
also,
I see limitation to that kind of form of thinking. Like, I can definitely appreciate the ways in which we use health as constitutive to physicality, as constitutive to like theory, but I think as well the merits of what he's saying and like his actions speak louder than the words. Like, we
but
don't
why
have to.
not? But why not exhaustively so? Why do you see that as constitutive but not solely influential?
Because there's so many more variables and complexities that come into play of something like someone's ideas that are non-reducible to bodily health.
But that's because we haven't cast a wide enough net in our understanding of bodily health, surely, right? Because there is no consciousness or sentience outside of our body.
Sure, sure, but I think like consciousness does have that difference in substance to the body, such that in the one way it's interdependent with the body, but in another it's not dependent on the body.
I agree with that, but I would say the most reliable way to trust your senses is when you're at your peacocking best. And if you're not even in shape, that's like a very reliable indicator throughout the ages that you
But
can.
is it,
Because, like,
I agree. Is this peacocking best not like having that extra slice of brownie? Like, is that not?
and still remaining in the same shape because you're physio-divergent in that way because you are literally like a special being. And you
Where
mentioned that, sorry, just one other thing. You mentioned the Jewish tradition, but I think that's the most testimonial to the thing we were speaking about, the Promethean myth. Is there anything more antithetical to that than the Jewish tradition and the Semitic myth of the, you also mentioned the apple bite and deception and original sin and susceptibility to, like the ailments of the human condition and all of that being kind of coalesced into our conception of what is the origin of evil. There's probably nothing more diametrically opposed to Prometheanism. Not that I'm like saying that's how you should live your life, but nothing more opposed to that than the Jewish tradition.
and Promethean is kind of hubris.
Promethean is taking pride in sacrilege and dissent and active sin rather than passive
Yeah.
sin. So
Almost like, yeah, Promethean is the one that didn't fear God, where the Jewish tradition is to fear God.
yeah, and to place nobility in, lying prostrate before God rather than making God do that to you.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, hubris in a very contained sense, yes.
Hmm. Yeah.
How do you
Well, I
commit?
think like I want to see Eric Weinstein as Nietzschean here, and so I'm kind of trying to square that with, and I think like this is a kind of a concluding thought. Like, this is the last thing I have to say about it, would be one way of understanding Eric Weinstein. I think like you've given some space there, and like this isn't all about Eric Weinstein, just for our viewers who don't know who it is. Like, this isn't actually nothing about Eric Weinstein. This is like
Yeah,
totally about the forms of spirit as expressed in
in
the
culture?
world. And this is also about how, yeah, we create, how we are creators of form through matter. And this question of AI and technology in the future, and yeah, drive. So nothing about Eric
Yeah, no,
Weinstein,
it's
but
nothing
he's a very
particular.
helpful
He's a
topical.
representation, but this is purely a thought experiment as to how much control we have over society, what true intentions are, the cognizing subject. It's more about the background questions and using something as a representation for that.
Yeah, and like I would even be, I'd be considering like him, bringing the personal into the philosophical, or bringing the historic into the scientific, the way that he grew out of this tradition where, he had stories from his grandparents that's ingrained within his body, that's ingrained within his memory, and he's driven by it. It creates a drive in the same way that we are driven and drive creators from what happened to us in an early experience. Our psychodynamic upbringing dictates a lot of what we eventuate and actualize, and our will to power is almost exclusively always a realization of that, primal drive in a sense. And I'm wondering if he has just been authentically true to himself in that way. And although he is tasked with, he has this like big thing of overcoming, like he's overcoming that fear of not having an exit door when there is an impending apocalypse, when there's impending doom of a third world war that will wipe us all out. He's striving to find the door and the way out. And what he does to do this, what's born out of this, like fear, but it's like just creative tension and inspiration that is, he creates geometric unity. He goes into the geometry of Euclid and recategorizes and redefines, based on experiments in the latest theoretical physics, a new system to create, new potential laws. And physics moves slowly, and it's through progressions and progressions of thinkers and theories and testing that we come to something. But he's putting the foundations of a hypothesis that could potentially create a new form of physics and take us to a place where we can have things like, traveling through wormholes, and we can unlock space in a way that wasn't previously possible. And so how is that, like, is that not a kind of an expression of high art that, Nietzsche would absolutely applaud the attempt, that comes from, that deeply personal, and isn't, and Weinstein's doing that. He's like sharing that, he's confessing that this comes from his, Jewish lineage, and it's the ultimate realization of that, and it's his stake of saying, I have no option but to do this. And just for reference, his brother Brett Weinstein is the biologist who's trying to essentially understand our biology so that we can, know what's biological, know what's controllable, and then, he's a rationalist in some sense, make better decisions based on that understanding to then take us forward. So he's approaching it from the biological sphere. So how can we make ourselves better thinkers and sense makers? And Eric is trying to say, okay, we couldn't possibly be better thinkers and sense makers. We nearly, we created weapons of mass destruction. So we need a saving grace to this. And I would see that as fiercely Nietzschean.
You're very charitable to these two brothers of destruction. I am not at all. And best case scenario, I would say that's what those two's image is online, and that's what they claim to do. Self-proclaimed even. Not many people are adherents and don't stay for long in that camp. But if they do, then they extract a high amount of genuine, knowledge and wisdom from them and then readily leave. But that's Nietzschean, right? You the best way to thank them is by not remaining their pupil for a long time. But what I would say is searching perennially for an escape valve is not Nietzschean. It's a refuge for the weak. And I understand that there's a novelty factor and a genuine artistry and visionary nature to that type of thinking. And it's not the project itself that I take issue with. It's the man behind the project, because I can't trust the project if it's done by him. And I can only trust the project barely.
I mean, to me, and I would almost say it sounds very like early Nietzschean, that perspective, but the later Nietzsche is one that almost comes round to it a little bit more, in terms of like, okay, we're gonna judge something not by its fruits, but by the fruits of its, grandchildren. And so if, Eric passes away because he gets diabetes, etc. But his theory does get us off Earth, and we actually do unlock a new side of physics. I think like he stands as one of like the greatest thinkers of time, and you get there's such a large charge of potential in his ambition, and so I feel like there's a way to see it in that light too.
I agree. It's very early Nietzschean, but I'm 25, so I'll stick to that, And maybe when I'm 55, I'll come around to the Weinstein brothers or something, but they'll be long, 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 long gone by then. The only thing I was going to say is, when are we not perennially almost in World War III? And the scare tactics of that can't dictate how we live our lives, right? War is the father of all things. If we were to get to World War III, that would be a normal state, where we live in a highly privileged.
I think you're being overly Apollonian. I think you're not being true to the Dionysian.
Okay, I'm also not a mouthpiece for Nietzsche. I like the guy, but like I'm not a spokesperson, right? And it's a very anomalous case that we haven't had a world war for 70 years. That's not the norm. If it does happen, that would be the norm. There's not some crazy end time state. And I highly question the man who's searching for escape valves already, should it happen. Like, raise your kids, go to the gym, bro. What are you talking about? But yeah, that would be my closing thoughts on that. What would you have to say, my good man?
Oh, my closing thoughts is to shake my head at that last statement. But I think, yeah, all in all, this has been a new favorite episode. This has been like really, really gratifying. And yeah, I think like for me, my kind of head goes fast enough in a normal state, but to inebriate it with caffeine gives a whole other two coffees today, gives a whole other wheel spin. And I was really feeling that, and really noticing the state that caffeine is able to induce, not as something to just produce mental alertness, but to produce like what this podcast was, And I think like many other times we've done this and not had caffeine, but I just feel like particularly close to the logic that was unfolding. And I think, it's caffeine gives you that state of like categorical malleability, but it enhances your memory as well. So you can make all these disjunct points, but you can tie them back together, and you can remember what was said the week ago, and you can remember what was said 4 weeks ago really well in a context like this. So I just want to give an ode to the spirit of caffeine that was present.
Miss
and also
friend of the show.
I also want to say how grateful I am for you as an interlocutor. It was proper interlocution in this episode, and I think it really spun a bright and powerful flame. And there was some just like amazing moments of coming together and discussing, and we both kind of progressed forward like at the same pace and in a lot of these ideas. So this was remarkable.
It really, really was. That's such a nice closer, and I couldn't agree more about the state induction of caffeine as a substance and as a stimuli. It's perfect for this type of thing. You got to find your sweet spot with it, as I think you learned today. But no, definitely, man. It brings together many things. It allows you to speak symphonically, and it causes a bit of a it synthesizes and allows for symphonies, is a shorthand way of saying it. This was highly enjoyable, and the second half was particularly different, but in a meaningful and valuable way nonetheless. So we kind of expect and unexpect everything to happen. And as I do with World War III, some people will do anything but eat right.